3 nights ago, a truck driver with more than 12 years of experience hauling refrigerated freight across America gave me a warning that honestly sounded impossible at first, because according to him, several foods people buy every single week could become expensive, hard to find, or temporarily missing from stores before July 2026 arrives. And before you ignore this as another internet rumor, I want you to stay with me until the end, because everything you are about to hear is connected to real supply chain, pressure, rising transportation costs, unstable weather patterns, and changes already happening inside grocery distribution networks right now. And if you appreciate research-based videos that focus on facts instead of fear, then subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next few months could completely change the way ordinary families shop for food. Mike is not a social media influencer. He does not sell survival products, and he does not make dramatic predictions. Online for attention, he spends most of his life driving thousands of miles between warehouses, farms, food processing plants, and distribution centers, and according to him, something unusual has been building slowly behind the scenes over the last year because, for the first time since he started trucking, several major problems are hitting the food supply chain all at once. He told me retailers are becoming more cautious with inventory, warehouses are changing delivery schedules and transportation. Companies are already preparing for possible shortages in certain product categories. Before summer 2026 even begins, the first food Mike warned me about was coffee, because global coffee production has been under pressure after difficult weather. Conditions affected harvest quality in important growing regions, including Brazil and Vietnam, and while coffee is not disappearing worldwide, the issue is that unstable harvests, combined with transportation costs and export delays, can reduce availability and increase prices much faster than most consumers expect. Mike explained that some distributors are already limiting how much inventory they commit to, because nobody wants to get trapped paying higher shipping costs later. The second food on his list was chocolate, especially products made with high cocoa content, because cocoa farms in parts of West Africa continue struggling with crop disease, weather stress, and lower output, which has already pushed cocoa prices upward in global markets. And Mike said many manufacturers are quietly reducing product sizes while charging more because maintaining consistent supply is becoming harder than it used to be. The third food he mentioned was olive oil, because several olive-producing regions experienced repeated drought conditions over recent seasons, causing lower harvests and rising costs. And according to Mike, imported oil shipments have become less predictable, which means consumers may start seeing fewer discounts, smaller inventories, and sudden price spikes at stores without much warning. The fourth food he warned about was rice. And this surprised me because most people assume rice is always available everywhere. But Mike explained that export restrictions, climate-related crop pressure, and shipping disruptions can create temporary supply stress in some regions, especially when panic buying begins, and he believes consumer fear itself can make shortages appear faster than actual production problems, because the moment people think a staple food may become expensive, they immediately start overbuying it. The fifth food Mike talked about was beef, because cattle production costs continue increasing due to feed prices, drought pressure, fuel expenses, and transportation costs, and he told me some retailers are already reducing certain meat selections instead of carrying large inventories because refrigerated freight is becoming more expensive to move across long distances. What made this conversation different from every other shortage discussion online was how calm Mike sounded, because he was not predicting the end of society, and he was not telling people to panic buy or fill garages with food. He simply said the system becomes fragile when weather, fuel, labor, and transportation pressure all hit at the same time. And according to him, families who prepare early in a smart and controlled way will feel much less stress than those who wait until shelves already look empty and prices suddenly jump overnight. So before we continue, comment below with the one food your family depends on the most, because the next foods Mike warned me about may surprise you even more than the first 5 already did. After hearing Mike explain the first 5 foods, I honestly thought the conversation was almost over. But then he leaned forward and said the next 3 categories could actually become even more unpredictable because, unlike coffee chocolate or olive oil, these products depend heavily on stable transportation, refrigeration, energy, and packaging systems working perfectly every single day. And according to him, that stability is becoming harder to guarantee across the supply chain. The 6th food Mike warned me about was eggs, because although most people think egg shortages ended long ago, the reality is that producers still face pressure from feed costs, disease outbreaks, transportation expenses, and rising packaging prices. And Mike explained that when one part of the egg supply chain gets disrupted, stores react quickly by limiting purchases or raising prices because eggs move fast and retailers do not keep massive backup inventories sitting in storage. He told me some grocery managers are already more careful with ordering patterns than they were 2 years ago because they understand how quickly demand spikes can empty shelves. Once panic buying starts, the 7th category Mike warned about was frozen processed foods, including frozen dinners, frozen chicken products, frozen pizzas, and prepared freezer meals, because these products depend on uninterrupted cold storage from factory to warehouse to truck to store, and even small disruptions in fuel supply energy costs or refrigeration systems can slow deliveries significantly. Mike explained that frozen foods are much more vulnerable than canned products because maintaining cold temperatures during transportation is expensive, and if transportation costs rise sharply, retailers may prioritize essential fresh goods instead of lower-priority convenience meals. He also mentioned that frozen food companies rely heavily on packaging materials, transportation coordination, and stable electricity costs, which means multiple weak points exist. At the same time, the 8th and final food category Mike warned about was cooking oils, especially imported vegetable oils and palm oil products, because global shipping routes continue facing uncertainty due to fuel costs, weather disruptions, and international trade instability. And according to Mike, cooking oils affect far more products than most consumers realize because they are used in snacks, restaurant foods, processed meals, baking products, and everyday grocery items across almost every aisle in a supermarket. What shocked me most during this conversation was when Mike started explaining the 5 forces he believes are quietly building pressure behind all these food categories at the same time, because according to him, most consumers only notice supply problems after shelves already start looking empty. But inside the logistics industry, warning signs appear much earlier. The first force he mentioned was transportation instability, because nearly every food item depends on trucks, ships, rail systems, and fuel availability to reach stores. And when diesel prices increase or shipping routes slow down, grocery prices react almost immediately, especially for refrigerated freight, which costs significantly more to transport than dry cargo. The second force Mike described was fertilizer pressure, because farming at modern scale depends heavily on fertilizer production and stable energy markets. And when fertilizer costs rise, farmers either reduce planting increase prices or absorb losses that eventually affect the entire supply chain. The third force was climate volatility, because unusual weather, including drought floods, heat waves, and irregular rainfall patterns, continue damaging crops in multiple regions at once. And Mike said growers are becoming increasingly nervous about long-term harvest consistency, especially for products like coffee, cocoa, olives, and rice. The fourth force he talked about was labor. Shortages because warehouses, trucking companies, farms, and food processing plants continue struggling with staffing issues in some areas. And according to Mike, consumers rarely notice labor problems until delays already spread across the system, creating slower deliveries and inconsistent inventory levels. The fifth and final force he warned about was consumer panic, because he believes fear itself can create shortages faster than actual production decline. Once people hear rumors about possible scarcity, they begin buying more than normal, which causes temporary empty shelves and viral social media panic that spreads faster than official information ever can. Mike kept repeating that his message is not about fear, it is about preparation. Because according to him, families who slowly build practical food reserves during stable times avoid emotional shopping during unstable periods. He recommended focusing on foods households already eat regularly instead of wasting money on expensive survival kits or extreme stockpiling strategies. He also said rotation matters more than quantity, because buying food nobody actually uses eventually creates waste instead of security. And according to Mike, the smartest households heading into 2026 will not necessarily be the richest ones, but the families who stay informed, organized, calm, and prepared before everybody else suddenly realizes the supply chain problems they ignored for months are finally showing up directly at the grocery store checkout line every single week. The more I researched after speaking with Mike, the more I realized this warning is not really about one truck driver predicting disaster, but about understanding how fragile modern convenience has quietly become. Because most people walk into grocery stores assuming shelves refill automatically forever, without thinking about the thousands of moving parts required to keep food constantly available at stable prices every single day. And according to Mike, that system works efficiently only when fuel transportation, labor, weather trade routes, packaging factories, refrigeration networks, and consumer behavior all remain stable at the same time. But once several of those systems experience pressure together, even temporarily, stores begin reducing inventory, increasing prices, and limiting product variety long before consumers fully understand what is happening. Mike told me one of the biggest mistakes families make is waiting until shortages already appear before preparing, because by that point prices are usually much higher and panic buying spreads faster than reliable information. He believes the smartest response is calm, steady preparation instead of fear, because preparation gives families options while panic creates stress, poor decisions, and unnecessary waste. According to Mike, the first step is simply building a small rotating reserve of foods your household already uses every week, instead of buying random survival products that nobody enjoys eating, he suggested. Adding 1 or 2 extra shelf-stable items during normal shopping trips, including rice, pasta, canned vegetables, oats, peanut butter, beans, flour, powdered milk, and cooking oils, because these foods last longer, remain flexible for different meals, and can reduce pressure on grocery budgets during unstable periods. He also recommended paying attention to freezer organization, because frozen food waste becomes expensive when prices rise. And according to him, many families lose money simply because they forget what they already stored. Mike explained that another hidden issue consumers ignore is how quickly companies change packaging and portion sizes during supply pressure, because sometimes shelves do not look empty at first glance, but products quietly become smaller while prices increase. And he said this trend is already happening across several food categories, including snacks, frozen meals, coffee products, and chocolate items, which means many consumers are technically paying more while receiving less without immediately noticing the difference. Another important point Mike made involved restaurants, because when wholesale food costs rise, Restaurants often respond by shrinking portions, simplifying menus, or increasing prices. And according to him, families who depend heavily on takeout meals may feel the financial impact of food instability earlier than households that cook basic meals at home. He also warned that convenience products usually become expensive, faster than simple ingredients, because heavily processed foods require more packaging, transportation, refrigeration, and factory coordination compared to staple items like rice beans, oats, or pasta. What surprised me most about Mike was that, despite everything he described, he remained extremely calm throughout the conversation, because he repeatedly said, "This is not about society collapsing or grocery stores permanently running out of food." His concern is that modern consumers have become psychologically dependent on unlimited choice, instant restocking, and low-cost convenience, without realizing how vulnerable those expectations become during periods of economic and supply chain pressure. He believes the families who adapt best during uncertain times are not necessarily the wealthiest, but the most informed, organized, and flexible, because they understand how to manage rising prices, rotate stored foods, reduce waste, and avoid emotional buying behavior before shortages become headline news. And honestly, the more I thought about it, the more his warning made sense, because recent years already showed how quickly transportation issues, labor shortages, weather disruptions, and sudden demand spikes can affect everyday products in ways most people never expected, which is exactly why Mike says awareness matters now more than ever. Not because fear is useful, but because informed preparation gives ordinary people more control during uncertain situations. And if there is one final message Mike wanted people to understand, it is this: do not wait for social media panic or empty shelves before taking supply chain risks seriously. Because by the time fear spreads publicly, prices usually rise first and options disappear second. So if this video helped you see the food system differently, comment below with the one item you are going to start paying more attention to after today. And if you want more deeply researched videos about supply chains, preparedness, grocery trends, and practical strategies for uncertain times, subscribe right now, because the next 12 months may reward calm, informed, and prepared families more than anyone expects.